Welcome back. In this video, we'll be looking at how to integrate Auth0 into our application. We'll make a few changes to our application frontend to allow our user to sign in and sign out, and then we'll also allow the application to determine if that user is signed in or signed out to make changes on the front end based upon that. So let's look at how we can get started with this. The first step will be to get the code from the GitHub repository for this course. In particular, you're going to need to look for 5.2 integrating Auth0 into frontend. I suggest downloading the code as a zip file and then unzipping it inside of your local operating system. Now for this course and this video, we're going to need to get all the code inside of the frontend folder and eventually replace our existing frontend code with that. But before we jump into that, let's go back to our editor and compare the two different bits of code. So I'm going to copy recursively from the tilde, which is the home directory, /downloads folder. And I'm going to get the contents of the Serverless Learn section folder here and look for 5.2. And I also just want to get the contents of frontend right now. And I'll bring that into our present directory and call it temp frontend. Now, let's go ahead and clear this. And you'll see that this appeared right here. So now we should be able to compare temp frontend to our current frontend inside of the application. Now, I'm also going to do one other thing, which is to spin up a server for both of the front ends so that we can compare them live inside of our browser. So let's go ahead and change directories into the front end here, change directories into temp front end here, and make sure that we have all of our index.html files in here. So we have index.html in here. Let me make this more clear. We also have index.html. So in order to spin up the local server, I'm going to do python 3-m http.server. Now in this case, I'm going to have one of these be in port 3000 and one of these be in port 8000. So let's go ahead and do that for both of them. And now we should have our basic front end be on port 3000 and our new front end be on port 8000. So if I go back to our browser window here and I go over to our localhost 8000, looks like we're currently loading the newer version of the UI. And if I go back to 3000, which is a little earlier of a number, we're loading the previous version of the UI, which is exactly what we want. So let's compare what the differences are here. Well, first, in the previous version, we have this song pick list where anybody can go in and vote, and they can do that whenever they want. But what if we wanted to actually have the user have to sign in before they do this? Well, that's what we'll be starting to add for the next version of the UI. Additionally, we don't have any way to log in or log out on our earlier application. So let's change this and let's go to 8000. And now you'll see we've added a login and a logout button, and the ability to vote has disappeared. And only when we're actually able to log in and log out will we be able to add that vote capacity back in. Now, a few things you'll also notice here. We don't currently have the right API endpoints to load in the current vote counts. So let's go ahead and change our application to enable this. So I'm going to exit out of the old version of the UI because we're not going to be using that much anymore. And I'm going to exit out of the new version too because we're eventually just going to move that into our old front end folder that we'll be replacing. Now inside of this temp front end here, let's look at the differences inside of the actual files. So now let's compare these index.html files right here. And if I click compare selected, we should be able to tell the differences between our previous version and our current version. Ignore some of the CSS changes up at the top. Those aren't too important. The first major change in the HTML you'll notice is that we're adding the login and logout button. And we're also adding this hidden avatar field that'll only show up when they're signed in. If we keep scrolling down, you'll also notice that we've added the class hidden to the ability to vote for your favorite songs. So this will keep this particular section hidden from the user unless they're signed in and we make some changes in the JavaScript later on. Now finally, if we keep scrolling down, you'll see that we have a few different hidden fields to prevent those things from being seen unless they're signed in. And at the very bottom, we're also adding two new JavaScript files. The first is one we're getting from Auth0's CDN called Auth0 spa.js, which adds all the JavaScript to interact with Auth0 services to enable sign-in pretty easily inside of our application. Now, the other file right here is the auth0.js file, which contains all the code and logic to handle signing in and signing out inside of our application. So let's take a look at how auth0.js actually works. Let's go into the JS code for the temp front end here and look at it. Now, it's starting just by enabling this new variable here that's null that will eventually be turned into the Auth0 client. And then it goes and gets configuration values from authconfig.json. Now, if we look at that file, currently it's blank, and we actually will need to replace it with real values when we create an Auth0 account and get these values for our own application. Now, if we go back to auth0.js, it's going to enable us to configure a client with this configure client function by loading those two values in. And if we keep scrolling down, you'll see this is where the logic happens to either turn on or turn off the gated hidden content that I showed you in index.html, depending on if the user is signed in or signed out. Now, there's also going to be helper functions like getID token claims, which Auth0 will make available to us to get things like the URL metadata for the user's profile picture, or other information like the user's name or first name or last name. Finally, we have a few other bits of information towards the bottom to handle logging into the application, logging out of the application, and also processing the redirects from Auth0 to our application. So what will happen inside here essentially is when we see a code equals and a state equals inside of the URL bar, that'll tell us that we've actually started the login process, and we need to call this other method of the Auth0 client to handle those two values and then turn it into a logged in user with metadata that's stored locally inside of our browsers. Now, I'll show you that in a minute, but the next thing we'll need to do to change this around is importantly to go to app.js and replace the existing API endpoints with the ones that we were working with previously that we actually deployed. So you'll need to take this value inside of your API endpoint, go into app.js, and replace those two values there and save. Now, once you've done this, you should be able to go back to the locally running page and see a few changes on it that actually showcase the number of current votes. But for right now, let's proceed onward in getting Auth0 configured. Those next values that we'll need will be the Auth0 config values for domain and client. So let's go back to the browser and go over to our Auth0 page here that I've already signed into. I won't bore you with the sign-up process, but you can sign up for an Auth0 account by going to auth0.com and following through with the prompts, and you'll get an account that has a pretty substantial free tier for a number of users inside of any application you create. Once you finish that sign-in process, you should have what Auth0 calls a tenant, and you'll see the actual tenant that I'm using here is FMC Serverless. Now, inside of that tenant, you'll also be able to create different applications, APIs, and do a bunch of other configuration, some of which we'll touch on later. The first step for you will be to create an application. Now, I've previously created one that we can take a look at as a final version, but I'm also going to go through the process of you going through the entire setup yourself. So let's click Create Application either from the Application section, or if you go to the Dashboard section, you can also click it there too. I'm going to call this one Serverless Jams 2.0, which will just be for this demo. Technically, it's your 1.0. And I'm going to click Single Page Web Application and Create. Now, inside of here, I could go through their own tutorial and quick start for how to get started with things like Angular, React, or Vue, but since I'm using JavaScript and I've actually already written my code in line with their demo, I'm going to skip this quick start section and just go straight to Settings. Now here I'm going to need to copy the domain for my application, and that's one of the first values that's going to go into my code. I'm going to replace the example replace me domain that I've included here with this fmcauth0.com. Now what this will change is it'll tell us where to be redirected when the Auth0 client is created, and we want to know where to go on Auth0's website to start that sign-in process. We'll also need a client ID, which will tell us which application we're interacting with. So let's get that down too. Should have this client ID for ROB is the very beginning, so we'll call this our Rob client ID, and let's save that in there too. So now that we've made these two changes, if I go into the temp front end, let's try this again, and let's run that same Python 3-m http.server command. In this case, let's put it on port 8000 because it's our newer version, so I'll make it the bigger number. So now when I load Serverless Jams back up locally, because I changed those API endpoints to the correct ones, you'll see that we have these vote counts loading in, but we still can't quite log into the application. To get that next step to happen, we'll need to add some configuration settings here that will allow us to interact with the URLs for signing in from Auth0 and then sending it back to this application while we're running things with localhost. Now, we'll need to change some of these callback URLs, web origins, and logout URLs. The first thing I'll need to do is just type out http://localhost, and then I'll do a colon again for port 8000. So let's go ahead and copy this across these few values here, and let's save this at the bottom. Now once I've done this, if I go back to Serverless Jams and refresh this page, you should see that now I can log into this application. And when I click Login, you'll see Serverless Jams 2.0 pop up here, and I can log in with Google. Now, I haven't created a new account yet, and because I'm using localhost as part of my application, it'll give me this additional window and ask me to verify that I want to do this. And once that process is completed, I'll now see some changes in the UI. The first is that this song and vote section appear back again and enable us to vote once again using the UI. The second is that we now have this little icon up here that shows my face from my Google profile, and we can log out of the application. Now with these changes, if I go to Inspect here, and I go to the console, we now also have access to, in our application, the ability to use the Auth0 client to check things like, is this user authenticated using the Auth0 method? Looks like that is true now. And if we want to get more metadata about this user, we can use things like get ID token claims. If we go into this, some of the data inside of here includes things like that URL for my profile picture image, as well as my first name and last name, and such as a nickname inside of my account, and other details like my email. Now with all of this set up, if we wanted to actually push this into production, we'd have to make a few more changes. We'd go back to our application details page here, and instead of localhost 8000, we'd include something like serverlessjams.com with https:// and in addition to serverless jams, we're also going to want to make sure we use www.serverlessjams.com. Now in between, we'll need to make sure we separate them with a comma, and we can copy these across all our different sections here. Now I'm going to keep localhost 8000 actually in these three so we can continue testing, but once we're done with this, let's go ahead and save the changes at the bottom there. So now this should mean that we can go back to our application, and if we wanted to push this into production at our actual domain, we could do that. The next step would be to remove recursively our front end folder, so we're nuking everything in a previous version, and then we can actually move temp front end folder just to front end. So this will fix up our application so that when we're deploying our front end client, you'll actually see that we're deploying it from this front end folder here now, which contains the new Auth0 configuration values and file, and also loads in the SDK into that front end file in index.html. So I'm going to close out of those previous files that are no longer relevant because they're stored elsewhere and we deleted them. And we can run the serverless client deploy command to send up that front end into AWS S3. Now, after this process finishes, we're also going to need to clear that cache one more time. So I've loaded up inside of the browser here the CloudFront directory for this. And we can go to invalidations, create a new invalidation, and do /start, invalidate everything in there. And once this progress finishes, we should be able to go, instead of to localhost, we should be able to go directly to serverlessjams.com and see these new changes reflected in our website. And now we're able to log into this page in order to get access to everything else. You'll see we have Serverless Jams 2.0 showing up here, and we can log in with Google. And once we've logged in, we're then able to see the song vote button again and continue voting on our application. You also notice we can continue to log out, and we have this UI component with my face here, as well as access to all those methods that I was just talking about, things like is authenticated and the auth0.getTokenID claims. So these are things we could continue to use to get information about our user going forward. Now, in the future videos, we'll see how we can actually secure the APIs themselves behind voting on this endpoint. Because right now, technically, I don't need to be signed in order to vote on that endpoint. I could be sneaky and go into the source for my code, look at the index.html file, and then figure out where inside of the JavaScript I'm referencing these two endpoints. And then I could just make a post request to this endpoint using something like a Postman or something else. So in order to prevent that, we'll use Auth0 to add some security around the APIs that we've already created in the next videos. So hopefully I'll see you there.